In this election, we each face a question. What kind of country do we want to live in? There are some people who think we should be a country of chaos, of fear, of hate. But us, we choose something different. We choose freedom.
Freedom, freedom, I can't move. Freedom, cut me loose. Yeah. Freedom, freedom, where are you? 'Cause I need freedom too.
The freedom not just to get by, but get ahead. The freedom to be safe from gun violence. The freedom to make decisions about your own body. We choose a future where no child lives in poverty, where we can all afford health care, where no one is above the law. We believe in the promise of America, and we're ready to fight for it. Because when we fight, we win. So join us. Go to KamalaHarris.com and let's get to work.
I'ma keep on running 'cause the winner don't quit on themselves.
Neil, happy Friday.
Happy weekend.
I know. I'm so looking forward to it. Are you like writing postcards this weekend? Are you going to like call people in Florida? Do you have any election plans?
I will? Sure. Yes. I'm going to vote, actually. I have my, we can
Excellent.
vote by mail here in California. And I'm filling this out this weekend and I'm dropping it off at the handy dandy election box that's just a couple blocks from me, which honestly is how it should be done.
That is how it should be done everywhere. And I too have my mail-in ballot. And we have a terrific thing on the ballot in Massachusetts where the citizens get to decide whether we're going to make psychedelics legal for research. What do you think?
Well, this is interesting happening in Massachusetts with the history of Timothy Leary and Harvard and all that. So, I mean, that sounds really interesting. How's it polling? Is this going to pass?
I don't know. I think it's polling pretty evenly. And it's interesting because I've talked to progressives who are totally against it because they think, well, you make more drugs available to more people and you just get more problems. But this is actually different from marijuana legalization. When we got marijuana legalization, stores popped up all over Northampton, Massachusetts. And it did make pot more available. This is not, we're not having psychedelic shops. This is just making it available for medical use and for research. But there's also a component that says you can have a 12-foot by 12-foot plot where you grow psychedelics for your own use.
Oh.
This could become an issue at the community garden. I'm just saying.
Yeah.
Anyway, all right. We've got 17 days to the election, Neil. And 39 states and the District of Columbia have begun unrestricted early voting by mail, your state and mine being among them. 11 states have begun early in-person voting with the option to vote by mail if you have a reason to do so. And only 2 states have no early in-person voting at all. And you can only vote by mail if you're eligible. And it will shock you to learn that those states are Mississippi and Alabama.
Would have never guessed.
Would have never guessed. Right, exactly. Where they actually don't even let people vote on voting day very often. Yeah. So anyway, we'll see how long those 2 states hold out. But we've got some good news, which is Georgia is breaking early voting records. And also this week, a Georgia judge has invalidated a new state law written and passed by Donald Trump's allies in the state legislature, which mandated a hand count of the vote in 2024. In other words, there could be no machine count at all. You go straight to a hand count with those millions of votes. The judge said, no, that can't happen in 2024. He's leaving the door open to it happening in future years, which also sounds stupid. And the judge also ruled that county boards could not refuse to certify elections, which I think is also important.
Yeah, for sure. Enormous decision there. And also just the numbers in Georgia. I was blown away by that first day count. And of course, very moved to see the pictures of Jimmy Carter having voted, which is incredible.
I know. And he said, like, he wanted to live to cast a vote for Kamala Harris.
I know.
I was so moved by that, particularly given Carter's history in the state, where he actually, when he's inaugurated as governor, he stands up and says segregation has no place in
Yeah,
our society.
absolutely.
Yeah. So the bad news in Georgia is it's still a misdemeanor to give away food or water within 150 feet of the outer edge of a polling place or within 25 feet of any voter in line. And violations of this law are up to a year, they're worth up to a year in jail and $1,000 fine. So those long lines, people are going to have to bring their own water.
It's just so barbaric. I mean, whoever even thought of that as a thing to, make legislate to make a law. But I think that it just speaks to the depths of the anti-democratic efforts that are at work in this country. But there's just such a cruelty to this one that feels just really un-American, or maybe it's very
Yes.
American, perhaps.
Yes. Well, and very Southern, since one of the things that has happened across the South is the reduction in polling places.
Right.
So people have to drive farther, and this is particularly true in Texas. People have to drive further to get to a polling place. And then, because there's so many people coming from so many places, they wait for hours. And apparently, the wait in Georgia a couple days ago was an hour and a half.
Right. Unbelievable.
And that's early voting. I
Yeah.
mean, imagine what it's going to be like on election day. Okay, so we also have good news coming out of Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania voters have requested 1.7 million absentee ballots. And here's the breakdown, Neil. 1,024,284 have been requested by Democrats, including my mother. 498,926 by Republicans. So that's twice as many by Democrat requests than Republicans. And then 206,485 by independent voters. So those early voting numbers look really good for Kamala Harris.
Yeah, I mean, they have to be very happy with that. We talked a little bit last week about just the big disparity between Republican voting habits and Democratic voting ones, right? Mail-in votes or early voting is overwhelmingly Democratic, day of is overwhelmingly Republican. So there's a lot more to happen in Pennsylvania and all these other places. But, a lot of this is about getting a huge early lead and then hoping you hang on through election day. And I think they must be happy with those numbers.
Yeah, I think they are. And, I also think it is a reminder that conspiracy theories, on the one hand, can get in the way of democracy by just giving people the wrong information. But some of the wrong information is that voting early gives the left, an opportunity to get rid of your ballot. And so Republicans have really shot themselves in the foot with this one, even though they are encouraging early voting and they're encouraging mail-in voting this time around. The conspiracy that mail-in voting is somehow less reliable has really been ingrained in the mind of MAGA. Yeah. So today we are talking about freedom and fear. When I say freedom in this election, Neil, what do you think?
Well, I think of the Democrats. I think of Kamala Harris's message. I think of the way that they seized on this word, and they showcased it at the Democratic National Convention this summer, and that they have really made it the central theme of this election. And I think that is historically significant because that's a word that Republicans have really seemed to have a monopoly on, especially in recent history. And the reclaiming of this word and the particular usage of it in this election cycle has been fascinating to watch, and I think very effective.
Yeah, I think it's been effective too. And let's just talk for a minute about the Beyonce song, which is from her Lemonade album. And that was the album that she made after her husband, Jay-Z is her husband, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, after her husband had sort of, confessed to her about his infidelities, and it had become very public, and he had sort of publicly humiliated her with his behavior. And so she cut this incredibly fierce album, of which Freedom was one of the songs. Why do you think Harris chose that particular song?
Well, I think obviously Beyonce, like what a perfect person to bring into, to make that song part of your campaign, because it just feels, who's bigger than Beyonce? But freedom here is really interesting, particularly, again, not just the word and the reclaiming of it, but then, as you've outlined here, the sort of history around the creation of this album and that song, and also the ways in which I think it ties into themes of sexual freedom and bodily autonomy that are front and center in Kamala Harris's election bid, particularly around the right to abortion. So it feels like those things, it's not like a direct connection, but it does feel like those things are certainly relevant and tied together.
Yeah, I think that's right. I watched the video several times because the song is just infectious, and I've only heard chunks of it in Harris's advertising. And one of the things that it also made me think about are the ways in which Black freedom has been a promise that has never quite been kept. And that there are these stages, emancipation, um, the civil rights movement, the entrance of Black people in the 70s on a much broader scale into the larger economy and so on. But the pervasiveness of racism in American society still kind of keeps freedom slightly beyond reach. And this song sort of aggressively says, I want it and I'm going to get it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that that's compelling, again, because of who the Democratic nominee is and also who the Republican nominee is.
Right.
And then also there's this, and I think we talked about it recently, some interesting polling numbers, at least that we're seeing right now, of like Black men potentially voting for Trump at a proportion that's much
Right.
higher than they historically do for Republican candidates.
Right.
Presidential candidates. And then, the message that Obama made a week or so ago, directed at Black men, around this theme, I think, of freedom and of like that Black women have been foundational and sort of the backbone of Black freedom in a lot of ways. And that it was really it was a responsibility of Black men to come through in this election.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think it sort of points to something bigger than a Republican Democrat divide and the pro choice, pro life divide, which is this sort of pervasive sense that the more women achieve, the more men, shall we call it the patriarchy, go into motion to make it stop. And I'm thinking of that meeting that Trump had, that bizarre meeting with women, and I guess it was like Republican women, in which he talked about being their protector.
Yeah.
And that they didn't need to be afraid because he would be there to protect them. And so it seems like this kind of revanchism in the Republican Party that is stoking a gender war.
Yeah, and I think it would be important to say white women here, right? Because I think, a lot of the protective language and the very gendered articulation of what he provides as a leader, to me, is also tied up in race and racism. This is a message for white women. It's about patriarchal power, but it's also, I think, very much about white privilege, and that women benefit from that, and that the white privilege is tied to a sort of patriarchal order. Those things are all bound up together, but some of it's explicit and others are like implicit, and certainly not spoken.
Right. So we've got freedom in the Harris campaign as a way of talking about the state standing behind people's rights, people's civil rights, people's bodily autonomy. But conservatives have kind of owned the word freedom for a long time. I mean, you said earlier that Harris was kind of taking it away from them. And
Yeah.
we've talked on these video chats before of, taking back the flag, taking back patriotism. So what do conservatives mean when they talk about freedom?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important because this is that a word that's maybe the most American word, and yet can mean very different things in different historical moments, particularly when used by very
Right.
particular historical actors. Republicans tend to mean free markets. I think
Hmm.
anti-communism, especially in different, earlier historical moments of the 80s and the 90s, it had that
Right.
sort of resonance and meaning. Individual freedom. Of course,
Hmm.
there's limits to that, or certain meanings to that that are not, I think, as broadly conceived as Democrats might imagine individual freedom, but and particularly freedom of religion, but freedom of religion in very pointed usages as well, which is mostly about, I wouldn't even say Christianity, but I think evangelical Protestantism. But those are the sorts of freedoms that I think are central to the Republican imagination when they talk about this word.
Yeah, and just following on what you're saying, freedom also for conservatives often means an increased autonomy from the state.
Hmm.
Homeschooling is freedom, gun ownership is freedom, and that these institutions that conservatives have carefully cultivated that take individuals' lives out of the realm of government are also ways of defending yourself from other people. So your freedom is also something that is constantly, you need to constantly defend it, right?
Yeah, I think that's such an important point here, and I think also particularly just making very clear that it is a freedom is rendered in sort of opposition to government power
Right.
in the Republican imagination. I don't know if I would go so far to say it's anti-government, although I think in its current iteration that feels like an appropriate usage. But like if we're thinking
Right.
historically, I don't think it's always meant like a full-blown
Right.
anti-government position, but certainly
Right.
one of freedom is a sort of counter to government power. And I think what's
Right.
interesting about what you sort of suggested at the beginning, the Kamala vision or the democratic message around freedom is it's government backed freedom, it's government secured
Right.
freedom that's really being foregrounded here in the democratic message. A government that secures rights for individuals as opposed to a freedom in which individuals don't have to worry about or be overwhelmed by or be repressed by government power. Those are pretty different
Right.
worldviews, really, certainly different notions of what this idea means.
Yeah, and of course, as the Harris campaign points out, on the kind of in the kind of world that you and I live in, conservatives don't care about freedom at all. They don't want people to be able to be free to teach certain ideas. They don't want people to be free to read certain books. They don't want people to be free to marry, as you and I have. So there is a kind of negative freedom that conservatives are promoting, in which conservatives wish to be free from the rest of us.
Yes.
Um, and hence a lot of cases like Hobby Lobby. Go ahead and be gay, but don't expect me to pay for it.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think one other thing, that Harris has really included in her articulation of freedom is the freedom to vote. And that just
Yeah.
ties into what we were saying at the beginning about all those, repressive measures being put in place at Georgia and other places to really minimize voting participation. And she points out that like this is the foundational freedom upon which all these other freedoms she's talking about grow out of and depend upon. And
Right.
so, yeah, I think
Yeah.
you just have these very, very different discourses emerging from this same shared word that's set in motion completely different worldviews and politics.
Yeah. Well, and I want to turn to fear as well, because on the one hand, freedom and fear are not the opposites of each other. But the Trump campaign has, of course, been characterized as stoking fear, and that's what Trump does in his rallies. If I'm not elected, you won't have a country anymore. I'm going to, protect you by letting those people wage lawfare against me. So there is a kind of fear that he projects. If I'm not here,
Yeah.
they will come to get you. Um, it's interesting because I have a friend on Twitter who's I've been friends with for a long time. His name is Howard, and we sort of joust with each other a little bit. And he wrote me the other day and he said, I know you're very afraid of Trump being elected, but you need to know that I am just as afraid of Kamala Harris being elected. And I wonder if you could talk about this question of fear in politics. First of all, have you ever seen fear in an election like we've had the last two cycles?
I mean, I guess if we go back a third cycle, well, you mean like from 2016 on, right? I
Yeah,
mean, Trump came down the escalator and delivered a message of fear in the lobby of Trump Tower, right? The fear of Mexican
right.
murderers and rapists coming into this country. And I think fear is often a theme, is an emotion that gets animated in election cycles, but the sort of central place of it in Trump's political rise and his message feels unparalleled. And I think that the thing that's also significant about this is the way that he positions himself in a messianic role almost, right? Like he's the lone person that could prevent these things from happening. And I don't know. I mean, I think, there's all this talk about cults. And
Yeah.
I sort of don't love that language or that way of thinking about Trump, or I worry about the ways it sort of limited our understanding of it. But as this fear talk has been ramped up all the more in the last couple of days, and as he is doing truly fascistic um, speechifying in these last couple of stops, the sort of dynamic of fear as the heart of a cult movement
Yeah. Yeah.
feels like almost the only way to interpret what's happening here in this election. And it feels like there is no historical antecedent for this in American presidential politics.
Yeah, I think that may be right. Although arguably, one might say during World War II, when Franklin Delano Roosevelt was reelected in 1944, and it was the fourth time he'd been elected, he was obviously sick. He was obviously old. That voters, in fact, had this kind of fear that if they voted for someone else, that they would lose the war, that they would lose everything. That
Yeah.
there was this kind of vulnerability in the country. And so even reelecting a sick and clearly dying, if you actually look at the pictures in retrospect, Roosevelt was a better protection. And I want to talk about Roosevelt and fear a little bit, because of course the government protecting you from fear is kind of a core concept to liberalism. I mean, when Roosevelt is elected, his inauguration speech in 1933, he says the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And then later, when he talks about the four freedoms, I guess that's 1944. He
Mm-hmm.
says, freedom from want, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, and freedom from fear.
Yeah.
Right. So there is a way in which the idea of fear is attached to freedom for liberals, because the state is there to protect us from fear.
Right, to defeat fascism abroad and to secure the basic needs of people at home, right? The freedom from fear of want, the freedom to live in peace at home, of the domestic front. it's a foundational, as you said, a foundational concept of, I think, 20th century liberalism.
Yep.
Although one that I think we haven't always seen through the years as articulated and sort of as front of message as it's been again in this election cycle. I wonder,
Yeah.
just to give another historical moment, because I think that's really a smart observation about the 1944 election. I mean, another moment that strikes me in which Americans were afraid of a lot of things is sort of 1980s apocalypticism and the ways in
Hmm.
which the Cold War and Soviet power really loomed large in the American imagination in the 80s. Um, and I think fear was an animating component of American thought and even of American politics. But Reagan was such a different character to sort of
Right.
navigate that emotion and to sort of speak to it, but to, and I don't want to like over romanticize Reagan in a way that I think often a lot of historians have done recently, but to sort of to push it in an to give it an optimistic bent too, that
Right.
like America would prevail. It had to, and there were legitimate things to be fearful of. But there was a sort of sunnier disposition, I think, to the ways in which Reagan and sort of American politics in general characterized and responded to those fears of Soviet domination, of apocalypticism and such that were really
Right.
at play in the 80s.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. And of course, the paradigmatic reelection commercial for Reagan in 1984 was Morning in America.
Right.
And you look at that ad and so, people are getting married, people are buying houses, people are having children. It's Morning in America. There's nothing but good stuff ahead. And it was, a bit of a shock, as campaign commercials are. But I think the other thing you're saying is that Reagan's paternalism was of an entirely different variety
Yeah.
from
Yeah.
from Trump's. Trump's
Hmm.
is angry patriarch, and Reagan was friendly, comforting dad.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's the role Harris is playing too. Is she's Mamala.
Yeah.
She's the one who's going to take care of us, and she will comfort us. Um, I wonder if Kamala Harris needs to do more to say the Democrats will protect you from fear. That's what our support for Social Security is about. That's what our support for universal health care is about. Or they're not for it anymore, but
Yeah.
Medicare, Medicaid. That all of the building blocks. The money that has been put into infrastructure, the Infrastructure Act. Well, we have bridges that just sort of spontaneously fall down. And the amount of money that has been pumped into fixing broken and aging infrastructure should, in fact, make Americans feel safer when they drive to work in the morning.
Yeah. Those are like real things that exist, that affect
Right.
people's everyday life. And I think the sort of frustration is the way that Republicans, and I think Trump particularly, have been so successful at conjuring up imagined threats
Right.
and making those front and center of a Republican imagination, even as global pandemic and a rotting infrastructure and a cratering social safety net are real and right in front of us.
Right.
And those things are not, I don't know, maybe not as sexy or not as, they don't loom as much in their imagination, but
Yeah.
there's a real bait and switch obviously happening, I think, among the Trump-led Republican Party these days.
I think that's right. And then, just to wrap this part of the show, I think we also have to acknowledge that a lot of Democrats are just terrified that Trump is going to get elected
Yes.
again. And what effect do you think that has? Do you think it's mobilizing or do you think it's paralyzing?
I think it's a bit of both. I think it has been mobilizing, but it's hard to be mobilized by that over time. And I think it also leads to a lot of apathy,
Hmm.
and sort of just really a nihilism, I think, is probably what it leads more to. That's the real destructive
Right.
force of just sort of throwing our hands up and like, what can you do about it? But I think that that's a lot of what Kamala's message and Barack Obama's have been, and Oprah's
Right.
too. Remember, it's like, get out and do the
Right.
work. Like, do the work.
Right. Right.
Take those fears and take those emotions and direct them into action.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. I think that's right. And yet, I think the other place I've seen fear playing is one of my younger queer relatives was pissed off at me for sharing an Instagram video where a an actor is talking to himself basically as like, the person who's not going to vote because of Gaza, and then the person who says, well, if that's your issue, I hope you're ready for transgender rights to be gotten rid of around the country, and sort of marches down all the things. These are the things that will happen to you
Yeah.
if Donald Trump is elected. And I shared that, and my young relative was really pissed. And I was like, why? And they said, well, you're just trying to frighten us. And frightening people into voting for Harris is counterproductive. And there was a part of me that understood, because these were genuinely felt feelings. And then there was another part that said, you should be frightened, actually, as a young queer person. You should be frightened of Trump becoming president. And I can't tell you otherwise.
Yeah, and it's frustrating to hear that story. And of course, I feel like you go onto Twitter or X or whatever it's called these days, and you see one iteration of that after another
Yep.
from the kids, and that's sort of like, it feels like a refusal to actually grapple with a very likely reality if this
Mm-hmm.
election goes in a certain direction, and the asymmetry of that sort of disbelief with the absolute certainty that Trump supporters have of what's at stake for them.
Right.
And that imbalance is very concerning when we're in this close of an election that's going to hinge on, turnout,
Right.
as it
Right.
always does.
Right. I agree with you. I think there's also something in there around the difficulty in talking about compromising, because votes are always a compromise,
Absolutely.
but one need not feel compromised by casting one's vote. And I actually think after the election is over, we should do a show on compromise
That'd be great.
in history. Okay, so what do you want to go viral this week, Neil?
What I want to go viral this week is this really smart short piece in the Atlantic from David Graham. The title of it is "The Secret of Trump's Economic Message." It uses this recent event, which probably a lot of people saw, or at least clips of it because it went so viral, of Trump's appearance at the Economic Club of Chicago a couple of days ago, where there was this interview led by the Bloomberg editor. I assume you
Yep.
watched it or saw the
Yep.
worst, most egregious clips here. And David Graham at the Atlantic really, sort of walks through the interview and just sort of points out the most just mind-blowing parts of it all, which is just this most, I mean, if you haven't watched it, it is this
Right.
completely unbelievable event where you think that this guy who cannot put a sentence together or a thought, who can't even respond to a question, and certainly doesn't understand basic ideas, is potentially going to be once again the leader of the free world,
Right.
and have access to the nuclear codes. And, like, none of this is new to us, although I think we are seeing more and more just alarming examples of how far gone Trump is. But
Mhm.
David spends some time, and this is not like the most mind-blowing observation, but I think it's a really important one, which is that he writes, Trump's reductionism may be the real source of his appeal when it comes to the economy and other policy areas.
Mhm.
By restricting his discussion to the bluntest, broadest, and vaguest of terms, he sells an appealing illusion. And I just, people should read the whole piece because I think he really
Right.
develops the argument nicely here. But, it can be so maddening to watch this
Right.
guy not able to, like, not even know what a tariff is, and yet continue to insist
Right.
on it, or to say that, no, China will pay for it. And to just feel like, how in the world is this guy even on the political stage, let alone, potentially going to win this election? But that, like, the simplicity of his articulation
Hmm.
may really resonate with a much larger American population than many of us are willing to acknowledge and to admit, and that we really need to confront that, and we need to think about that and to understand the appeal here, the clarity of
Right.
vision that to us seems like gobbledygook. For many who like think, well, I don't really understand the economy, or I don't understand these issues, I don't even care to, that there's sort of a
Right.
clarity of his vision that to them is reassuring and is actually the hallmark of competence. So
Right.
read the piece. I actually think read everything by David Graham at The Atlantic. He's one of my favorite writers, and I think he particularly has just been so spot on in his psychological analysis of both Trump and the Trump voter in a lot of his recent columns. So we'll link to this piece, but I think click on his name and just read everything he's written recently at The Atlantic.
Yeah, and I will also link to Trump's appearance at that economic forum as well, because it's a really good example of how much he has deteriorated.
Yeah,
And in part, I think there's a real cognitive problem that is growing rapidly worse. But I think one of the reasons it's growing rapidly worse is he's exhausted from campaigning.
clearly.
I don't think he's getting enough rest. I think he needs more rest, as most people of his age do. So there is a kind of befuddled quality. But I think what you're saying also about the simplicity of the economic message, because actually most people don't understand economics. I mean, really well educated people don't understand the difference between a stock and a bond.
Right.
Um, and so to just say, I will do this and then this will happen, people are like, okay, great.
Okay.
And actually, what I want to go viral is another example of that, which is the Trump Vance tickets proposed policy of deporting 11 million people. And JD Vance said the other day, well, we probably wouldn't deport 11 million people all at once, but if you deported 1 million people a year, then other people would just start to leave and, it would pick up. But as it turns out, there's a real problem with that. And my thing to go viral this week is from the New York Times earlier this week by Marcela Valdez, who should actually get a prize for this story. And it's called What a Crackdown on Immigration Could Mean for Cheap Milk. Undocumented labor quietly props up the entire American economy, but nowhere more dramatically than on dairy farms. And it caught my eye for a couple of reasons. One is that the price of milk and other groceries is one of the things Republicans have been harping on.
Yeah.
As it turns out, one of the reasons milk is as cheap as it is because there are all sorts of federal regulations on how much you're allowed to charge for it. So milk would be more expensive now without the federal government. But the other thing is that you cannot fully automate dairy farms. You can, in fact, automate milking, but because we are talking about live animals here, cows have to be gotten to the machine. They have to be plugged into the machine. You have to care for their udders. You have to feed them. You have to give them shots. And it's really nasty work. And it's nasty work that requires skills. And the other reason this caught my eye is that Valdez looks at a dairy farm in southern Idaho near Twin Falls, which is where my grandparents lived. And I spent a lot of time in my childhood where we were used to immigrant labor, and immigrants came from Mexico to work in the sugar beet fields, to move
Mm-hmm.
pipe, and do a range of agricultural tasks. And because you could go back and forth across the border fairly easily, people would come for the season and then they would go back to Mexico. Because the border is such an issue now, people can't go back, so they're stuck. But the other thing is that this farmer who runs like 400 head of dairy cow or something, that the work is so intense and the work is so dirty and difficult, and at the same time requires so many skills, that if he loses his workers, he's going to have to shut down his dairy farm. And he says there are no Americans to do this job. You don't just bring somebody from Boise who's unemployed and say, now you're going to work on a dairy farm, that it takes years of experience to learn how to do this. And that his people are, they know the cows, they know the farm, they know the work. And also, they are mucking around in ankle high mud and poop and piss and so on. So that the point that Valdez is making is our dairy industry is completely and totally dependent on what are now undocumented workers, and that the only way to save the dairy industry is to find some way to legalize these workers and not penalize them for not having documents. I really recommend this piece. Everybody should look at it. Milk is one of the staples of a household diet.
Yeah.
And the milk industry is a key part of our economy. And it is, in fact, propped up by the willingness of people to come to the United States from Central America and Mexico and work in it. And we should be thanking them.
Yeah. That sounds fascinating. I'm going to read that as soon as we get off.
Yeah, it's great. So Neil, thanks so much for meeting up with me this week. And next week, we're going to be even closer either to freedom or fear.
That's a long way to put it. See you then.
Okay. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.